broadcast is live. Exciting. Well, hello everyone. Sorry, leaning forward because I've got the cat on my lap. You might hear or see him, anyone watching, if he decides to get up and move. But hopefully now he has a lap, Gatsby will be soothed. So welcome everyone to I think it's the second of our Cosy Literature streams, featuring both me and Amy, also known as Gagging for Lit on the internet. So we thought, as last time, it's kind of interesting and useful, particularly for a horror channel like Proper Horror Shows, to look at some of the literature behind our kind of our most interesting horror films. Because obviously kind of the genre of horror isn't just what we see on our screens. It's come from a long history of writing and literature and thinking. So Amy and I thought it would be more interesting to look at some of the authors and the texts that inform the horror films that we love today. This stream is slightly delayed. We were going to do it in February when Horror Show was doing her Lovecraft month, but I think particularly my life basically got in the way of two of our attempts to stream. So finally, we have made it happen. So thanks everyone for the patience. But we're already thinking about future streams and different kind of short story writers or horror writers who've written short stories that we could look at for future episodes. But yes, I hope you are all ready and interested to find out a little bit more about the lovely H P Lovecraft. I had a conversation with a family member yesterday in which I was told that he is just an unredeemable bigot, and why would you even read his literature? So that was charming. Sorry, detour. But yes, we thought we'd look at both an essay that Lovecraft wrote on cats and dogs, and so we'll start with that, and then we're going to look at the short story Dagon, which I recorded a couple of days ago, and then Amy and I'll chat a bit about, well, we'll chat about the cats and dogs thing first, obviously, and then we'll listen to Dagon and chat about that afterwards. So yeah, over to you, Amy.
I would just like to express my apologies to any dog fans in the audience before I proceed with this. But I think that even though it is a bit of a silly essay on cats and dogs, it isn't really to do with horror. It does show quite a lot of H.P. Lovecraft's philosophy with regards to like art and aesthetics. So it does have utility as opposed to a cheap laugh at dog people. So I'll start now. Being told of the cat and dog fight about to occur in the Blue Pencil Club, a new thing for your circle perhaps, though not unfamiliar to amateurdom as a whole, I could not resist contributing a few domestic yowls and sibilants upon my side of the dispute, though conscious that the word of a venerable ex-member can scarcely have much weight against the brilliancy of such still active adherents as may back upon the other side. Aware of my ineptitude at argument, my valued correspondent, curator James Ferdinand Morton of Patterson, has sent me the records of a similar controversy in the New York Tribune, in which Mr. Carl Van Doren is on my side and Mr. Albert Payson Terhune on that of the canine tribe. From this I would be glad to plagiarize such data as I need, but Mr. Morton, with genuinely Machiavellian subtleties, I cannot pronounce this word, I'm sorry, subtlety, sorry, has furnished me with only a part of the feline section while submitting the doggish brief in full. No doubt he imagines that this arrangement, in my view of my own emphatic bias, makes for something like the ultimate fairness, but for me it is exceedingly inconvenient since it will force me to be more or less original in several parts of the ensuing remarks. Between dogs and cats, my degree of choice is so great that it would never occur to me to compare the two. I have no active dislike for dogs, any more than I have for monkeys, human beings, negroes, cows, sheep, or petrodactyls. But for the cat I have entertained a particular respect and affection ever since the earliest days of my infancy. In its flawless grace and superior self-sufficiency, I have seen a symbol of the perfect beauty and bland impersonality of the universe itself, objectively considered, and in its air of silent mystery there resides for me all the wonder and fascination of the unknown. The dog appeals to cheap and facile emotions, the cat to the deepest founts of imagination and cosmic perception in the human mind. It is no accident that the contemplative Egyptians, together with such later poetic spirits as Poe, Gautier, Baudelaire, and Swinburne, were all sincere worshippers of the supple grimalkin. Naturally, one's preference in the matter of cats and dogs depends wholly upon one's temperament and point of view. The dog would appear to me to be the favourite of the superficial, sentimental, emotional, and democratic people who feel rather than think, who attach importance to mankind and the popular conventional emotions of the simple, and who find their greatest consolation in the fawning, dependent attachments of a gregarious society. Such people live in a limited world of imagination, accepting uncritically the values of common folklore, and always preferring to have their naive beliefs, feelings, and prejudices tickled, rather than to enjoy a purely aesthetic and philosophic pleasure arising from discrimination, contemplation, and the recognition of austere absolute beauty. This is not to say that the cheaper emotions do not also reside in the average cat lover's love of cats, but merely to point out that in I can't pronounce that word either. There exists a basis of true aestheticism which Kinophilie does not possess. The real lover of cats is one who demands a clearer adjustment to the universe than ordinary household platitudes provide, one who refuses to swallow the sentimental notions that all good people love dogs, children, and horses, while all bad people dislike and are disliked by such. He is unwilling to set up himself and his crusade of feelings as a measure of universal values, or to allow shallow ethical notions to warp his judgment. In a word, he had rather admire and respect than effuse and dote, and does not fall into the fallacy that pointless sociability and friendliness, or slavish devotion and obedience, constitute anything intrinsically admirable or exalted. Dog lovers base their whole case on these commonplace, servile, and plebeian qualities, and amusingly judge the intelligence of a pet by its degree of conformity to their own wishes. Cat lovers escape this delusion, repudiate the ideas that cringing subservience and sidling companionship to a man are supreme merits, and stand free to worship the aristocratic independence of self-respect, an individual personality joined to extreme grace and beauty as typified by the cool, lithe, cynical, and unconquered lord of the housetops. Persons of commonplace ideas, unimaginative worthy burghers who are satisfied with the daily round of things and who subscribe to the popular credo of sentimental values will always be the dog lovers. To them, nothing will ever be more important to them than themselves or their own more primitive feelings, and they will never cease to esteem and glorify this fellow animal who best typifies these. Such persons are submerged in the vortex of Oriental idealism and abasement which ruined classical civilization in the Dark Ages, and live in a bleak world of abstract sentimental values wherein the mawkish illusions of meekness, devotion, gentleness, brotherhood, and whining, humility are magnified into supreme virtues, and a whole false ethic and philosophy erected on the timid reactions of the flexum system of muscles. This heritage ironically foisted on us when Roman politics raised the faith of a whipped and broken people to supremacy in the later empire, has naturally kept a strong hold over the weak and the sentimentally thoughtless, and perhaps reached its culmination in the insipid 19th century, when people were wont to praise dogs because they are so human, as if humanity were any valid standard of merit. And honestly, Edward Landseer painted hundreds of smug Fidos and Carlos and Rovers with all the anthropoid triviality, pettiness, and cuteness of eminent Victorians. But amidst this chaos of intellectual and emotional grovelling, a few free souls have always stood out for the old civilized realities which medievalism eclipsed. The stern classic loyalty to truth, strength, and beauty given by a clear mind and uncowed spirit to the full living Westernarian, confronted by nature's majesty, loveliness, and aloofness. This is the virile aesthetic and the ethic of the extensor muscles, the bold, buoyant, assertive beliefs and preferences of proud, dominant, unbroken, and unterrified conquerors, hunters, and warriors, and it has small use for the shams and whimperings of the brotherly, affection-slobbering peacemaker and cringer and sentimentalist. Beauty and sufficiency, twin qualities of the cosmos itself, are the gods of the aristocratic pagan type. To the worshipper of such eternal things, the supreme virtue will not be found in loneliness, attachment, obedience, and emotional messiness. This sort of worshipper will look for what which best embodies the loveliness of the stars and the worlds and the forecasts and the seas and the sunsets, and which best acts on the blandness, lordliness, accuracy, self-sufficiency, cruelty, independence, and contemptuousness and capriciousness and personality of all governing nature. Beauty, coolness, aloofness, philosophic repose, self-sufficiency, untamed mastery. Where else can we find these things incarnated, with every half of the perfection and completeness that mark their incarnation in the peerless and softly gliding cat, which performs its mysterious orbit with the relentless and unobtrusive certainty of a planet in infinity? That dogs are dear to the unimaginative peasant verger, while cats appeal to the sensitive poet, aristocrat, philosopher, will be clear in a moment when we reflect on the matter of biological associations. Practical plebeian folk judge a thing only by its immediate touch, taste, and smell, while more delicate types form their estimates from the linked images and ideas which the object calls upon in their minds. Now, when the dogs and cats are considered, the stolid churl sees only the two animals before him, and bases his favour on the relative capacity to pander to his sloppy, uninformed ideas of ethics and friendship and flattering subservience. On the other hand, the gentleman and thinker sees each in all its natural affiliations and cannot fail to notice that the great symmetries of organic life dogs fall in with slovenly wolves and foxes and jackals and coyotes and dingoes and painted hyenas, while cats walk proudly with the jungle's lords and with the haughty lion, the sinuous leopard, the regal tiger, and the shapely panther and jaguar as their kin. Dogs are the hieroglyphs of blind emotion, inferiority, servile attachment, and gregariousness, the attributes of the commonplace, stupidly passionate and intellectually and imaginatively undeveloped men. Cats are the ruins of beauty, invincibility, wonder, pride, freedom, coldness, self-sufficiency, and dainty individuality, the qualities of the sensitive, enlightened, mentally developed, pagan, cynical, poet, philosophic, dispassioned, reserved, independent, Nietzschean, unbroken, civilized, masterclass men. The dog is a peasant and the cat is a gentleman. We may, indeed, judge the tone and bias of a civilization by its relative attitudes towards dog and cats. The proud Egypt, wherein Pharaoh was Pharaoh and pyramids rose in beauty at the wish of him who dreamed them, bowed down to the cat, and temples were built to its good goddess at Bubastis. In imperial Rome, the graceful leopard adorned most homes of quality, lounging in insolent beauty in the atrium with a golden collar and chain, while after the age of Antonines, the actual cat was imported from Egypt and cherished as a rare, costly luxury, so many for the dominant and enlightened peoples. When, however, we come to the grovelling Middle Ages with their superstitions and ecstasies and monasticisms and maunderings over saints and their relics, we find the cool and impersonal loveliness of the Felidae in very low esteem, and behold a sorry spectacle of hatred and cruelty shown towards the beautiful little creatures whose mousing virtues alone gained its sufferance amongst the ignorant churls who resented its self-respecting coolness and feared its cryptical and elusive independence as something akin to the dark powers of witchcraft. These boorish slaves of Eastern darkness could not tolerate what did not deserve their own cheap emotions and flimsy purposes. They wished a dog to fawn and hunt and fetch and carry, and had no use for the cat's gift of eternal and disinterested beauty to feed the spirit. One can imagine how they must have resented pussy's magnificent reposefulness, unhurriedness, relaxation, and scorn for trivial human aims and concernments. Throw a stick and the servile dog wheezes and pants and shambles to bring it to you. Do the same before a cat, and he will eye you with coolly polite and somewhat bored amusement. And just as inferior people prefer the inferior animal which scampers excitedly because someone else wants something, so do superior peoples respect the superior animal which lives its own life and knows that the puerile stick-throwings of alien bipeds are none of its business and beneath its notice. The dog barks and begs and tumbles to amuse you when you crack the whip. That pleases a meek, loving peasant who relishes a stimulus to his sense of importance. The cat, on the other hand, charms you into playing for its benefit when it wishes to be amused, making you rush about the room with a paper on a string when it feels like exercise, but refusing all your attempts to make it play when it is not in the humour. That is personality and individuality and self-respect, the calm mastery at being whose life it is its own and not yours. And the superior person recognizes and appreciates this because he too is a free soul whose position is assured and whose only law is his own heritage and aesthetic sense. Altogether, we may see that a dog appeals to those primitive emotional souls whose chief demands on the universe are for meaningless affection, aimless companionship, and flattering attention and subservience, while the cat reigns amongst those more contemplative and imaginative spirits who asks the universe only the objective sight of poignant ethereal beauty and animate symbolization of nature's bland, relentless, reposeful, unhurried, and impersonal order and sufficiency. The dog gives, but the cat is. Simple folk always overstress the ethical element in life, and it is quite natural that they should extend it to the realm of their pets. Accordingly, we hear many inane dicta in favour of dogs on the ground that they are faithful, while cats are treacherous. Now, what does this really mean? Where are the points of reference? Certainly the dog has so little imagination and individuality that it knows no motives but its masters. But what sophisticated mind can decry positive virtue in this stupid abnegation of birthright? Discrimination must surely award the palm to the superior cat, which has too much natural dignity to accept any scheme of things but its own, and which consequently cares not one whit what any clumsy human thinks or wishes or expects of it. It's not treacherous because it never acknowledged any allegiance to anything outside its own leisurely wishes. And treachery basically implies a departure from some covenant explicitly recognized. The cat is a realist and no hypocrite. He takes what pleases him when he wants it and makes no promises. He never leads you to expect more from him than what he gives. And if you chose to be stupidly Victorian enough to mistake his purrs and rubbings of self-satisfaction for marks of transient affection towards you, that is no fault of his. He would not for a moment have you believe that he wants more from you than food and warmth and shelter and amusement, and he is certainly justified in criticizing your aesthetic and imaginative development if you fail to find his grace, beauty, and cheerful decorative influence an abundantly sufficient repayment for all that you give him. The cat lover needs not be amazed at another's love for dogs. Indeed, he may also possess this quality himself, for dogs are often very comely and as lovable in a condescending way as a faithful old servant or a tenant in the eyes of a master. But he cannot help feeling astonishment at those who do not share his love for cats. The cat is such a perfect symbol of beauty and superiority that it seems scarcely possible for any true aesthete and civilized cynic to do anything other than worship it. We call ourselves a dog's master, but whoever dared called himself the master of a cat? We own a dog. He is with us as a slave and inferior because we wish him to be. But we entertain a cat. He adorns our hearth as a guest, fellow lodger, and equal because he wishes to be there. It is no compliment to be the stupidly idolized master of a dog, whose instinct is to idolize, but it is a very distinct tribute to be chosen as the friend and confidant of a philosophic cat who is wholly his own master and could easily choose another companion if he found such a one more agreeable and interesting. A trace, I think, of this great truth regarding the higher dignity of the cat has crept into folklore in the use of the names cat and dogs as terms of opprobrium. Whilst cat has never been applied to any sort of offender more serious than a mildly spiteful and innocuously sly female gossip and commentator, the words dog and cur have always been linked with vileness, dishonour, and degradation of the gravest type. In the crystallization of this nomenclature, there has undoubtedly been present in the popular thing some dim, half-unconscious realization that there are depths of slinking, whining, fawning, and servile innobility which no kith of the lion and the leopard could ever attain. The cat may fall low, but he is always unbroken. He is, like the Nordic among men, one of those who govern their own lives or die. We have but to glance analytically at the two animals to see the points pile up in favour of the cat. Beauty, which is probably the only thing of any basic significance in all the cosmos, ought to be our chief criterion. And here the cat excels so brilliantly that all comparisons collapse. Some dogs, it is true, have beauty in very ample degree, but even the highest level of canine beauty falls far below the feline average. The cat is classical while the dog is Gothic. Nowhere in the animal world can we discover such really Hellenic beauty, Hellenic perfection of form, with anatomy adapted to function, as in the Felidae. Puss is the Doric temple, the Ionic colonnade, the utter classicism of its structural and decorative harmonies. And this is just as true kinetically as statically, for art has no parallel for the bewitching grace of the cat's slightest motion. The sheer, perfect aestheticism of Kitty's lazy stretchings, industrious face washings, playful rollings, and little involuntary shiftings in the sleep is something as keen and as vital as the best pastoral poetry or genre painting, whilst the unerring accuracy of his leaping and springing, running and hunting has an art value just as high in a more spirited way. But it is his capacity for leisure and repose which makes a cat preeminent. Mr. Carl van Vechten, in Peter Whiffle, holds the timeless restfulness of the cat as a model for life's philosophy. And Professor William Lyon Phelps has very effectively captured the secret of felinity when he says that the cat does not merely lie down, but pours his body out onto the floor like a glass of water. What other creature has thus merged with asceticism of mechanics and hydraulics? Contrast with this inept panting, wheezing, and fumbling, drooling, scratching, and general clumsiness of the average dog, with its myriad false, wasted motions. And in the detail of neatness, and the fastidious cat is, of course, immeasurably ahead. We always love to touch a cat, but only the insensitive can uniformly welcome the frantic and humid nuzzlings and pawnings of a dusty and perhaps not inodorous canine which leaps and fusses and rides about in an awkward feverishness for no particular reason save the blind nerve centres having been spurred by certain meaningless stimuli. There is a wearying excess of bad manners and an all-doggish fury. Well-bred people don't paw and maul one, and surely enough we invariably find the cat gentle and reserved in his advances, and delicate even when he glides gracefully into your lap with cultivated purrs, or leaps whimsically on the table where you are writing to play with your pen in modulated serio-comic pats. I do not wonder that Mahomet, that sheik of perfect manners, loved cats for their urbanity and disliked dogs for their boorishness, or that cats are the favourites of the polite Latin countries while dogs take their lead in heavy, practical and beer-drinking Central Europe. Watch a cat eat and then watch your dog. The one is held in check by inherent inescapable daintiness and lends a kind of grace to one of the most ungraceful of all processes. The dog, on the other hand, is wholly repulsive in his bestial and insatiate greediness, living up to his forecast kinship by wolfing most openly and unashamedly. Returning to beauty of line, it is not significant that while many normal breeds of dogs are conspicuously and admittedly ugly, no healthy and well-developed feline of any species whatsoever is other than beautiful. There are, of course, many ugly cats, but these are always individual cases of mongrellism, malnutrition, deformity, or injury. No breed of cats in its proper condition can by any stretch of the imagination be thought of as even slightly ungraceful, a record against which must be pitted the depressing spectacle of impossibly flattened bulldogs, grotesquely elongated dachshunds, hideously shapeless and shaggy Airedales, and the like. Of course, it may be said that no aesthetic standard is other than relative, but we always work with such standards as we empirically have, and comparing cats and dogs under the Western European aesthetic, we cannot be unfair to either. If any undiscovered tribe in Tibet finds Airedales beautiful and Persian cats ugly, we will not dispute them on their own territory. But just now, we are dealing with ourselves and our territory, and here the verdict would not admit of much doubt, even from the most ardent kynophile. Such a one usually passes the problem off an epigrammatic paradox, and says that, like Snookums is so homely, he's pretty. This is the childish penchant for the grotesque, the tawdrily cute, which we see likewise embodied in popular cartoons, freak dolls, and all the malformed decorative trumpery of the Billiken or crazy cat order found in the dens and cozy corners of would-be sophisticated cultural yokelry. In the matter of intelligence, we find the Canaanites making amusing claims, amusing because they so naively measured what they considered to be an animal's intelligence before the degree of subservience to the human will. A dog will retrieve, a cat will not. Therefore, the dog is more intelligent. Dogs can be more elaborately trained for circuses and vaudeville acts than cats. Therefore, O Zeus or Royal Mount, they are cerebrally superior. Now, of course, this isn't all the sheerest nonsense. We would not call a weak-spirited man more intelligent than an independent citizen because we can make him vote as we wish, whereas we cannot influence an independent citizen. Yet countless persons applied exactly parallel argument and appraising the grey matter of dogs and cats. Competition in civility is something to which no self-respecting Thomas or Tabitha ever stooped, and it is plain that any really effective estimate of canine and feline intelligence must proceed from a careful observation of dogs and cats in a detached state, uninfluenced by human beings, as they formulate certain objectives of their own and use their own mental equipment in achieving them. When we do this, we arrive at a very wholesome respect for our purring hearthside friend, who makes so little display and ado about his wishes and business methods. For in every conception and calculation, he shows a steel-cold and deliberate union of intellect, will, and sense of proportion, which puts utterly to shame the emotional sloppings over and docilely acquired artificial tricks of the clever and faithful pointer or the sheepdog. Watch a cat decide to move through a door, and see how patiently he waits for his opportunity, never losing sight of his purpose, and even when he finds it expedient to feign other interests in the interim. Watch him in the thick of the chase, and compare his calculating patience and the quiet study of his terrain with the noisy floundering and pawing of his canine rival. It is not often that he returns empty-handed. He knows what he wants and means to get it in the most effective way, even at the sacrifice of time, which he philosophically recognizes as unimportant in the aimless cosmos. There is no turning him aside or distracting his attention, and we know that among humans this very quality of mental tenacity, this ability to carry a single thread through complex distractions, is considered a pretty good sign of intellectual vigor and maturity. Children, old crones, peasants and dogs ramble. Cats and philosophers stick to their point. In resourcefulness, too, the cat attests his superiority. Dogs can be well trained to do a single thing, but psychologists tell us that these responses to an automatic memory instilled from outside are of little worth as indices of real intelligence. To judge the abstract development of a brain, confront it with the new and unfamiliar conditions and see how well its own strength enables it to achieve its object by sheer reasoning without blazed trails. Here the cat can silently devise a dozen mysterious and successful alternatives, while poor Fido is barking in the bewilderment and wondering what it is all about. Granted that Rover the retriever may make a greater bid for popular sentimental regard by going into the burning house and saving the baby in a traditional cinema fashion, it remains a fact loyal that whiskered purring Nig is a higher grade biological organism, something physiologically and psychologically near a man because his very freedom from the man's orders and as such entitles him to a higher respect for those who judge by purely philosophic and aesthetic standards. We respect a cat as we cannot respect a dog, no matter which personally appeals to the more to our mere doting fancy. And if we be aesthetes and analysts, Rather than commonplace lovers and emotionalists, the scales must inevitably turn in Kitty's favour. It may be added, moreover, that even in the aloof and sufficient cat is by no means devoid of sentimental appeal. Once we get rid of the uncivilised aesthetic ethical bias, the treacherous and the horrid bird-catcher prejudice, we find in the harmless, necessary cat the very apex of happy domestic symbolism. While small kittens become objects to adore, idealise, and celebrate in the most rhapsodic dactyls and anapists, iambics, and trochaics, I, in my own senescent mellowness, confess to an inordinate and wholly unphilosophic predilection for the tiny coal-black kittens with large yellow eyes, and could no more pass one without petting him than a Dr. Johnson could pass a sidewalk post without striking it. There is, likewise, in many cats something quite analogous to the reciprocal fondness so loudly extolled in dogs, human beings, horses, and the like. Cats come to associate certain persons with acts continuously contributing to the pleasure and acquire for them a recognition and attachment which manifests itself in pleasant excitement at their approach, whether or not bearing food and drink, and a certain pensiveness at the protracted absence. The late Tat of Alliston and Malden, great companion of our fellow amateur, Mrs. Miniter, reached the point of accepting food from no other hand but hers, and would actually go hungry rather than touch the least morsel from a kindly Parker sauce. He also had distinct affections amongst the other cats of that idyllic household, voluntarily offering food to one of his whiskered friends, whilst disputing most savagely the least glance from which his coal-black rival, Snowball, could bestow upon his plate. If he argued that these feline fondnesses are essentially selfish and practical in their ultimate composition, let us inquire in turn how many human fondnesses, apart from those springing directly upon primitive brute instinct, have any of the basis. After the returning board has brought in the grand total 0, we shall be better able to refrain from indigenous censure of the selfish cat. The superior imaginative inner life of the cat, resulting in superior self-possession, is well known. A dog is a pitiful thing, depending wholly on companionship, and utterly lost except in packs or by the side of his master. Leave him alone, and he does not know what to do except bark and howl and trot about till sheer exhaustion forces him to sleep. The cat, however, is never without the potentialities of contentment. Like a superior man, he knows how to be alone and happy. Once he looks about and finds no one to amuse him, he settles down to the task of amusing himself. And no one really knows cats without having occasionally peeked stealthily at some lively and well-balanced kitten which believes itself to be alone. Only after such glimpses of unaffected tail-chasing, grace, and unstudied purring can one fully understand the charm of those lines which Coleridge wrote, with reference to the human rather than the feline young, a limber elf singing, dancing to itself. But whole volumes could be written on the playing of cats, since the varieties and aesthetic aspects of such sportiveness are infinite. Be it sufficient to say that in such pastimes many cats have exhibited traits and actions which psychologists authentically declare to be motivated by genuine humour and whimsicality in its purest sense, so that the task of making a cat laugh may not be so impossible a thing even outside of the borders of Cheshire. In short, a dog is an incomplete thing. Like an inferior man, he needs emotional stimuli from outside and must set something artificial up as a god and motive. The cat, however, is perfect in himself, like the human philosopher. He is a self-sufficient entity in a microcosm. He is a real and integrated being because he thinks and feels himself to be such, whereas a dog can conceive of himself only in relation to something else. Whip a dog and he licks your hand. The beast has no idea of himself except as an inferior part of an organism, whereof you are a superior part. He would no more think of striking back at you than you would think of pounding your own head when it punishes you with a headache. But whip a cat and watch it glare and move backwards, hissing in an outraged dignity and self-respect. One more blow and it strikes you in return. For this is a gentleman, and your equal, and will accept no infringement on its personality and body of privileges. It is only in your house anyway because it wishes to be, or perhaps even as a condescending favour to yourself. It is the house, not you, it likes, for philosophers realise that human beings are at best only minor adjuncts to scenery. Go one step too far, and it leaves you altogether. You have mistaken your relationship to it, and imagined you are its master, and no real cat can tolerate that breach of good manners. Henceforth, it will seek companions of greater discrimination and clearer perspective. Let anemic persons who believe in turning the other cheek console themselves with cringing dogs. For the robust pagan with the blood of Nordic twilights in his veins, there is no beast like the cat, intrepid steed of Freya, who can boldly look even Thor and Odin full in the face and stare contemplatively, with great round eyes and undimmed yellow or green. And so, sir, I employ the singular, since I cannot imagine that you, O Jacob Ferdinand, would have the truly feline cruelty to spring all those 10+ pages on a deserving club which has never done you any harm. I believe I have outlined for you with some fullness the diverse reasons why, in my opinion, the smartly timed title phrase of Mr. Van Doren, gentlemen prefer cats. The reply of Mr. Terhune in a subsequent issue of the Tribune appears to me beside the point, insomuch as it is less a refutation of facts than a mere personal affirmation of the author's membership in that conventional, very human majority who take affection and companionship seriously, enjoy being important to something alive, measure merit by devotion to human purposes, hate a parasite on more ethical grounds, without consulting the right of beauty to exist for its own sake, and therefore love man's noblest and most faithful friend, the perennial dog. I suppose Mr. Terhune loves horses and babies also, for they go conventionally together in the great 100%ers credo as highly essential likings for every good and lovable human of the arrow collar and Harold Ball Wright hero school. Even though the motor car and dear Mrs. Sanger have done much to reduce the last two items. Dogs, then, are peasants and the pets of peasants. Cats are gentlemen and the pets of gentlemen. The dog is for him who places crude feelings and outgrown ethics and humanocentricity above austere and disinterested beauty, who just loves folks and folksiness and doesn't mind sloppy clumsiness if only something will truly care for him. Tableau of dog across a master's grave. Landseer, the old shepherd's chief mourner. The guy who isn't much for highbrow stuff, but is always on the square, and don't often the Sadie Post or New York world too deep for him, who hasn't much use for Valentino, but thinks Doug Fairbanks is just about right for an evening's entertainment, wholesome, constructive, non-morbid, civic-minded, domestic. I forgot to mention the radio. Normal, that's the sort of go-getter that he ought to go for in dogs. Ought to go in for dogs. The cat is for the aristocrat, whether by birth or inclinations or both, who admires his fellow aristocrats, even little Bellcap, who isn't especially fond of Phyllis. He is for the man who appreciates beauty as the one living force in a blind and purposeless universe, and who worships that beauty in all its forms without regarding for the sentimental and ethical illusions of the moment. For the man who knows the hollowness of feeling and the emptiness of human objects and aspirations, and who therefore clings solely to what is real, as beauty is real because it pretends to no significance beyond the emotion which it excites and is. For the man who feels sufficient in the cosmos and asks no false perspective of exaltation, who is moved by no mawkish scruples of conventional prejudices, but loves repose and strength and freedom and luxury and superiority and sufficiency and contemplation, who as a strong, fearless soul wishes something to respect instead of something to lick his face and accept his alternative blows and strokings, who seeks a proud and beautiful equal in the peerage of individualism rather than in a cowed and cringing satellite in the hierarchy of fear, subservience, and devotion. The cat is for the brisk, self-important little worker with a mission, but for the enlightened, dreaming poet who knows that the world contains nothing really worth doing. The dilettante, the connoisseur, the decadent, if you will, though in a healthier age than this, there were things for such men to do, so that they were the planners and leaders of those glorious pagan times. The cat is for him who does things not for empty duty, but for power, pleasure, splendor, romance, and glamour. For the harpist who sings alone in the night of old battles, or the warrior who goes to fight such battles, for beauty, glory, fame, and the splendor of a kingly court, athwart which no shadow of weakness or democracy falls. For him who will be lulled by no sops of prose and usefulness, but demands for his effort the ease and beauty of ascendancy and cultivation, which alone makes effort worthwhile. For the man who knows that play, not work and leisure, not hustle, are the great things of life, and that the round striving, merely in order to strive some more, is a bitter irony which the civilized soul accepts as little as it can. Beauty, sufficiency, ease, and good manners, what more can civilization require? We have them all in the divine little monarch who lounges gloriously on his silken cushion before the hearth. Loveliness and joy for their own sake, pride and harmony and coordination, spirit, restfulness and completeness, all here are present, and need but a sympathetic disillusionment for worship in a full measure. What fully civilized soul but would eagerly serve as high priest of Bast, the star of the cat, I think, is just now in ascendant. We emerge little by little from the dreams of ethics and democracy which clouded the 19th century and raised the grubbing and unlovely dog to the pinnacle of sentimental regard. Whether a renaissance of monarchy and beauty will restore our Western civilization, or whether the forces of disintegration are already too powerful to even the fascist sentiment to check, none may yet say. But in the present moment of cynical world unmasking, between the pretense of 1800s and the ominous mystery of the decades ahead, we have at least a flash of the old pagan perspective and the old pagan clearness and honesty. And one idol lit up by the flash, seen fair and lovely on a dream throne of silk and gold under a chrysalamphitine dome, is the shape of a deathless grace, not always given its due among groping mortals. The haughty, the unconquered, the mysterious, the luxurious, the Babylonian, the impersonal, the eternal companion of superiority in art, the type of perfect beauty and the brother of poetry, the bland, grave, competent, and patrician cat. That was a lot of lists. Oh, I was so confused when I read, because I'm reading it from the H P Lovecraft archive, and it's just written out without any of the original pictures in it. So I accidentally read out the sentence that went under the picture, and then was like, shit. But yeah, well, that was that was long, but I agree. I'm a cat person.
I've currently got Gatsby on my lap. I don't know if he's visible on camera, but yeah. There was, interestingly, a HB person referring to studies, but there was a recent study that said that cat people are typically more introverted, more independent-minded, and more kind of, I suppose, a lot of the qualities that Lovecraft was pointing out compared to dog people. And yeah, politically, I don't think he's wrong.
Well, I think it's quite interesting how he himself was really influenced by the sort of the decadent writers and the sort of art for its own sake, and a sort of rejection of the sort of the Victorian sentimentalism that quite a lot of people on the right today quite like. I like that there's that other perspective which takes into account the search for sort of higher ideals and almost the return of the sort of leisure class, which a lot of people in our circles, like Columba, attempt to affect. Do you know what I mean? I quite like that. Yeah, I like to see it from these two, this sort of perspective.
Yeah, and I think his comments on the role of certain kinds of philosophers, that in former times there would have been something meaningful for them to do. I was just thinking, like, my gosh, what would he have made of 2022 and 2023?
Yeah.
Oh god, we're 2023 now. Like,
yeah.
And as Horror Show pointed out, his absolute rejection of productivity is quite an interesting one. Again, it's
you
all
do
that
get
sort
this
of
division. Yeah.
I
love that. I think you don't really see him as a humorous writer, and I know that I was reading that off a screen. I don't have that in book form, so it was quite difficult to read off a screen. So I did kind of butcher it a bit, but I thought it was genuinely hilarious.
Yeah, I was close to laughing out loud a few times,
and I love it does bring up into perspective, like who wants something to lick their face, especially a minging dog. I don't know. When you see people do that, you're like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I've got a few friends who describe themselves as dog mums, and their dogs as their fur babies. I mean, I've seen people do that with cats as well.
Yeah.
But there's the I think it was for Horror Show's Christmas special, she made a joke about the dog pill, which is white women slightly over-identifying with their dogs. Having slightly too intimate relationships.
People used to love to use cat lady as an insult, saying, when we get a woman ranting online about, like, bragging online about how good their life is as a child-free woman, and they'll say things like, I see lots of cat food in the future, and I'm like, oh, it doesn't seem that bad.
Also, I mainly see dog
Why not?
food. I think it's more likely dog women now, but yeah.
I do like dogs. I'm not like I am absolutely the kind of person that will stop and pet most dogs I encounter in the street. I like both, but cats are the best.
Indeed. Yeah, I'm definitely more of a cat person. I find dogs... I like dogs that are really quiet and very cat-like. Basically, I like my dogs to be as much like cats as possible.
I like a guinea pig. Maybe we'll need to bring the guinea pig back.
Yeah.
My neighbours used to have about 10 guinea pigs. A lot of them are dying now. But my mum used to look like they would just roam around the garden. And my mum used to like slam the windows, and they'd all jump and run for cover.
Oh. It's very interesting seeing the difference in behaviour between Gatsby and the neighbourhood cats and the chickens, who are much more naturally prey animals.
How does Gatsby get on with your chickens?
He's basically surrendered the garden to them and to next door's kitten.
Is he scared of them?
I think he used to be vaguely interested in them and then got scared by them because they're big birds, and they've got very, very sharp beaks and claws. So now I think they've mostly all accepted that he's really not a threat, so they largely ignore him. But he would occasionally, he'd sort of come out. There was one of our chickens she was the bottom of the pecking order, so kind of the meekest, gentlest hen. But whenever she saw him in the garden, she'd properly go for him. So I wonder if she thought he was below her in the pecking order. She needed someone, bless her.
Cats are also quite... I feel like they are... If I had to associate dogs or cats most with horror, it would be cats. There is something about the cat that is slightly... lends itself to the atmosphere of horror. So I don't think it's a surprise that Lovecraft himself likes cats and horror.
Yeah, I think it's that sort of independence of them. Something about that attitude somehow seems to lend itself more to horror.
And the sensitivity that they sort of have as well, like noticing things that humans don't. I think that's something a lot of people who don't like cats don't like about them, is they seem to notice sounds and sights that humans aren't able to see and hear. And that was the case in the rats in the walls. It was the cats that knew that there was something wrong, especially his favorite cat, whose name will not be named. The cat that will not be named.
I love that he couldn't resist slipping a reference to that in this essay.
Yes. Well, that's not the only story by him with a dubiously named black cat in it. So
it was clearly just a theme for him, wasn't it?
And there he is with his cat looking stiff.
It's just lovely. I like that essay gave a really human side to him. He just, you could imagine him being quite good company, like for an evening.
Well, context, because there was a lot of references to people and magazines and sort of cultural things that were going on around the time that I kind of stumbled over, because I'm like, what even is this? But he was, for a lot of his life, he was quite a recluse. Like, he was very introverted, but he really sort of came to his own in writing, and he was involved in a lot of amateur and underground publishing. Of fiction, of non-fiction as well as fiction, and he had this huge circle of friends who he wrote to prodigiously, who he never met in real life, and was involved in a lot of these sort of minor publications, which didn't last very long and had a sort of niche audience. So that's kind of the context of why this even came into being.
The introduction to it makes it sound like there was some kind of heated debate waging in sort of literary magazines at the time. And I want to find that society of people just like, we're going to write detailed philosophical essays about the cat versus dog debate. As someone in the chat earlier said, this Garfield comic strip is very highbrow.
Oh dear. Yeah, well, thank you, and apologies for any sniffing anyone may have heard. I am ill this week.
Oh dear.
I'm reading off the screen. So, but yes, that is Cats and Dogs, and it was Maven who introduced me to that. He's a cat fan.
Excellent.
Maven of Maven Politic on Twitter.
Excellent. He's gone up in my estimation, and he wasn't low in it before. All right. Well, we will now have the slightly trippy experience of me being possibly on screen twice, because we'll move on to the second reading of this evening, which is Dagon, one of Lovecraft's earliest, I think it's one of his earliest, I don't know if it was earliest written, but it's certainly one of the earliest published stories of his, I believe. Hopefully, for anyone in chat, obviously who doesn't know, Horror Show is in another room listening in, and therefore, hopefully, getting the hint.
Good evening.
Yes, good.
I'm
now going to read Dagon.
I have a book. I have a mug of tea.
And there's Gatsby.
And I'm now going to read Dagon by H P Lovecraft. By way of quick introduction, according to this edition, Dagon was written in July 1917 and is one of Lovecraft's most forward-looking stories. Many of its features, such as a landmass suddenly emerging from the depths of the ocean, a monster who may be one of an entire race of creatures dwelling on the underside of the world, the narrator's psychological devastation at the monster's mere existence, foreshadow the call of Cthulhu, and later stories, where the supernatural has been replaced by the scientifically plausible. But, as in Poe, it is the narrator's emotional trauma that is at the heart of the tale. The story was Lovecraft's first to be published in Weird Tales in October 1923. Without further ado, Dagon. I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more. Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below. Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realise, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death. It was in one of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider. The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners. So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone in a small boat with water and provisions for a good length of time. When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight. The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land. But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous. When at last I awaked, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished, for there was in the air and in the rotting soil a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish and of other less describable things, which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight, save a vast reach of black slime, yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet. As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realised that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions which for innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me, that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, strain my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things. For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness, and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for travelling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue. On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odour of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal. All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert. That night I encamped, and on the following day still travelled towards the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it. By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence. I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me. But I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined. Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of a few hundred feet the declivity became very gradual. Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyse, I scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon. That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express, for despite its enormous magnitude and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely. The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping at my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the Cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures. The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me, and unlike anything I had ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols, such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like. Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound. Plainly visible across the intervening water on account of their enormous size were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Doré. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint. Grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer, they were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiselled badly out of proportion with their scenic background, for one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe, some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born. Awestruck at this unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Vast, Polyphemus-like and loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, the while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measures of sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the slope and cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little. I believe I sang a great deal, and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing. I have indistinct recollections of a great storm some time after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard peals of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe. Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist, and amused him with particular questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god. But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries. It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men. Often I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may, at this very moment, be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols, and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down in their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean floor shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium. The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it. It shall not find me. God, that hand! The window! The window!
I did look like I was wearing the sofa nut. My jumper blended completely into the background. I don't have enormous shoulders.
I think that bringing Lizzo up was quite. It does bring up some unflattering similarities. He may have been a prophet.
He possibly knew too much.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I like the simplicity of some of his stories, where it's there's no speech in that. There's no other characters. It's mercifully short, and it's sort of, it's not quite nothing happens, but he sort of just observes something, and just seeing something is the horror.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, if you said it was one of his earliest ones, and I do think a lot, like we did the music of Eric Zahn, and that was also quite an early one before he sort of got his before he was sort of fully formed as the Lovecraft that he's remembered today, the writer of the Zulu mythos and stuff, in which the stories were a lot more simpler and a lot more neat, and I guess potentially technically accomplished, but that lack the excesses of what most people love about him today. If you see what I mean.
Yeah,
I guess I'm biased towards the former, but in the way the music of Eric Zahn, although it was a lot more concise in his later work, it developed an element of that, of the sort of the unknowable, the indescribable, things that beyond sort of science, the comprehension of humans in this sort of space in the area of sounds or sights or angles, things like that. Whereas Dagon has the more science fiction elements of his writing that would come in later on as well.
Yeah, and it's that sense of, as you say, kind of embedding it with some of the kind of scientific concepts. You know, he's talking about sort of speaking to anthropologists or trying to sort of be heard by them, and yeah, taking sort of playing on that. I suppose because it was written in 1917, I think. So obviously First World War, but then I'm just trying to remember when Tutankhamun's tomb and all the kind of big Egyptology and that kind of big craze for archaeology was probably, well, wouldn't have been happening during the First World War, but then was kind of building in the early 20s. So I was just wondering if that was possibly linked, but probably doesn't actually work with the timeline. Babbling.
I think it does. I think that really did start to kick in towards the end of the 19th century. You know, there was a huge interest in archaeology. You know, and that fueled a lot of the nationalist movements in the early 20th century as well. It wasn't an insignificant thing, and it was a huge part of like pop culture as well, of like especially adventure stories for young boys.
Yeah, certainly.
There's definitely a lot of exoticism mingled in with it as well,
for sure.
And also the finding of significance in ancient roots. It definitely permeated society at the time.
Yeah, definitely. And like within Dagon itself, also there's sort of that element of what archaeological artifacts can tell us that he doesn't realize, the narrator doesn't seem to realize the significance of. He talks about, these primitive carvings, and they'd misunderstood the scale. They'd done this whale being not much bigger than the sort of fish man. And then you realize, not a paragraph later, that actually, no, they hadn't missed the scale. They really are that big. And it's quite a nice, horrific moment. The cat has moved, so I can actually uncramp my leg now, which is nice. One thing I was looking up earlier is actually about Dagon, because I've seen him referred to a few times as a fish god. He's not actually. It's apparently quite a common misunderstanding, partly perpetrated by Lovecraft himself. So he was a Philistine kind of god, similar to had a sort of similar place in the pantheon, I suppose, to someone like Zeus, or who's sort of like the father of a pantheon of gods. No mention of fish whatsoever, and I think it was just based on. I was trying to find it. This is based on a couple of sort of articles I skim read earlier, but he was basically sort of considered the father of gods and kind of a weather god. But I can't. I'm trying to find where the kind of mixing up with the fish was. But one thing that was interesting was apparently he's credited with giving Sargon of Akkad power over a particular region. So clearly influential for the alt-right. Oh, here it is. I found the thing I was looking for. So the fish god interpretation comes from a sort of etymological slight misunderstanding, I think, because the word dag, it's got accents that I'm not quite sure how to pronounce, means fish in one language, but that's not the sort of part of speech that's used in the word Dagon or Dagan. And actually, what's interesting is that depictions that they thought were of Dagon were actually associated with a creature called Cthulhu, which obviously sounds quite familiar for fans of Lovecraft. So I wonder if that's where he got it from, or that's where Cthulhu came from.
I've got such a typical woman brain when it comes to stuff like this. That I just the mythology, the law, the language, the group. I don't care. I find it like I just want to read a good story, and it's like I just don't have that level of autism, I think, to truly appreciate this. It's very much the male sphere, I think.
I think it's one of those things I'm interested in. I was sort of interested in it because I'd seen him referenced as, a Philistine god. And I was just like, okay, so where has that come from? But yeah, to be fair, it was an idle bit of trying to read up on it on the train whilst being surrounded by people's elbows and luggage. So I don't think I got the deepest theological understanding of Dagon's place in the Philistine pantheon.
I don't know. There's definitely something Warhammer adjacent about it all.
It does. It's. I do find it. I think I might have a level of that sort of nerdery because I was noticing that like Dagon's father is apparently the Titan Uranos, who is referenced in the Greek mythology, because Uranos is the father of, or Uranus is the father of Saturn, who's the father of Zeus, and I'm going off down the train of mythology that I went off down as a kid, so I'll shut up now.
What is a Philistine god? Does that mean he's like
so,
in the way a dog lover's a Philistine?
No, so Philistines, I believe, were a tribe in the Middle East region. I think there will probably be people in the chat who know much better than I do. But yeah, so they were a particular civilization back in the kind of Old Testament period. So Dagon was a god that they worshipped. So he was a god of the Philistine people.
I always thought a Philistine was a German barmaid.
I like it.
It's the ultimate dad joke.
It's brilliant. I can hear Chloe chuckling in the background.
Gatsby didn't like that joke.
No, he gets more than enough puns here. Oh, that's lovely. It took me a second. I was like, oh. All right, yeah.
Oh, he's not happy.
No, I moved my leg while the recording was playing, and that made him move, and now he's cross. You can get back up. Okay. Sorry, I'm a bit distracted, and I just remembered that I'm on camera, so I'm just now kind of staring off camera at. All right, mate. Yeah, I was trying to think what else I think one of the things that struck me about Dagon is, as you're saying, it's a much tighter story than some of his later work. But it does kind of bring up some of those themes that he then elaborates on in great detail later on. And it's again that sense of the horror being something he doesn't really describe. What is it that's horrific? He doesn't. He leaves it to you to imagine just from seeing the narrator's reaction.
I've always seen these. A lot of these kind of stories to me have always felt more like science fiction than horror. And I know a lot of people would probably, disagree with that or call me a Philistine. but the ones that are more focused on his entities have always, I don't know, been slightly less appealing to me, but I do see that as a result of the sort of science fiction thing. I'm not the biggest science fiction fan.
Yeah, I can see that. I haven't read as much of them as I'd like. I think preparing for these streams has got me reading more Lovecraft than I'd read previously, because I'd very much had the my understanding of Lovecraft was as the friend I referenced earlier, the kind of, he was a bigoted writer of stuff about Cthulhu. And the friends I had who were obsessed with Cthulhu just seemed very nerdy, and I didn't want to find out more. So I'm really glad that thanks to this stream and the kind of focus on Lovecraft, I've had the chance to actually read a bit more of his work, because I can see what you mean about the science fiction element of it. And I suppose there's an interesting, I get sort of distracted with horror show quite a lot, talking about where sort of psychological thriller ends and horror begins. And I suppose it's a similar thing about where does science fiction end and horror begin. Because you could talk about Frankenstein. Is Frankenstein science fiction, or is it an early horror novel? Or is it both?
There's a C.S. Lewis essay called On Science Fiction, in which he talks about why these stories, why these writers, he doesn't mention Lovecraft himself, but why people like Lovecraft were sort of resigned, sort of dismissed as escapism, or as not serious literature, where he writes about how, I'll just see, because I have the book right next to me. I was sat next to a bookcase. But he writes about why these people hate it so much, and why I think why people dislike Lovecraft so much, I think, is part of the answer. There's obviously the racism and the sexism and the xenophobia and all of that, but I think that what it brings up is he uses the analogy of some people on a ship arguing in the lower levels of the ship, and if one of the members of the crew goes up to get some fresh air, he remembers that there's something more than the mundane bickering that is going on below, and it allows him to see put it into perspective and to see something higher. And I think that Lovecraft does that, but in a way he shows instead of exalting people by that there's more to life than the mundane bickering of humanity, it really just puts in, I think Lovecraft takes that and puts it on its head, and it shows that all of the bickering and the silliness is insignificant, because we're just bickering and silly people, and nothing really matters at all, because there's nothing, or there's just these horrors beyond our comprehension. And in a way, he says about his discussion about this theory with Tolkien, as Tolkien said to him, well, who's most preoccupied with the idea of escape? Who's most against escapism? It's prisoners. It's prison guards, sorry. And I think that's a lot of the reason why people don't like Lovecraft, is because he forces you to think about things that are below the petty squabbles of that keep you preoccupied in your daily life. And you see that in his Cats and Dogs essay as well. It says that he's preoccupied with he's preoccupied with the bigger picture, the overall purpose, whether that be in Cats and Dogs of a higher ideal like beauty, or in his horror, in which is the insignificance of it all.
I really like that interpretation, and I think that's definitely, that resonates with me, that sense of he makes you actually, like, I find films based on his work or sort of his stories are just, they're horrific, and they're also kind of sometimes unutterably depressing because of that. The ending is always just, well, what's the point? There's nothing you can do. I mean, I'm summarizing quite drastically there, but yeah, it's that sort of, he's making you see both how much more human life could be and how very meaningless it is at the same time, I suppose.
Can I found the passage. Should I read it?
Yeah, absolutely. Please do.
Yeah. If we were all on board a ship and there was trouble among the stewards, I can just conceive their chief spokesman looking with disfavour on anyone who stole away from the fierce debates in the saloon or pantry to take a breather on deck. For up there he would taste the salt, he would see the vastness of the water, he would remember that the ship had a whither and a whence, he would remember things like fog, storms, ice. What had seemed in the hot, lighted rooms down below to be merely the scene for a political crisis would appear once more as a tiny eggshell moving rapidly through an immense darkness over an element in which man cannot live. It would not necessarily change his convictions about the rights and wrongs of the dispute down below, but it would probably show them in a new light. It could hardly fail to remind him that the stewards were taking for granted hopes more momentous than that of a rise in pay, and the passengers forgetting dangers more serious than that of having to cook and serve their own meals. Stories of the sort I am describing are like the stories I am describing are like that visit to the deck. They cool us. They are refreshing, as in that passage in E.M. Forster where the man looking at the monkeys realizes that most inhabitants of India do not care how India is governed. Hence the uneasiness which they arouse in those who, for whatever reason, wish to keep us wholly imprisoned in the immediate conflict. That perhaps is why people are so ready with the charge of escape. I never fully understood it until my friend Professor Tolkien asked me the very simple question: what class of men would you expect to be most preoccupied with and most hostile to the idea of escape? And gave the obvious answer: jailers. I do think that is, to some extent, why people hate Lovecraft so much, is that he does not care for the sort of quibbles of the average man.
Yeah. I think you nailed it. And I think that's a really lovely note to end on, actually.
Well, except it's the opposite. Except it's the opposite, because the Lovecraft is just like, it's all futile anyway.
Well, yeah, there is that. There's always that with Lovecraft. I say lovely. As Margaret said, the Dunwich Horror and Shadow Out of Time had happy endings for values of happy, and I think the same applies to pretty much anything with Lovecraft. But yes, I think that is a very valid explanation, I think, of why he is reviled. Because he encourages us to question and wonder just what tentacled things are out there. So on that note, thank you very much, Amy. Thank you for the lovely essay. And I don't know if Gatsby's actually visible, but he's come back to my lap, and I think he enjoyed being praised with great extravagance by Lovecraft. So that was a real treat.
Honestly, you should have been more grateful. A dog would have been.
A dog would have loved it. This arthritic elder statesman doesn't care. I think he does a bit. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed that lovely essay and the sofa reading Dagon. And we'll use Proper Horror Show and our various Twitters to advertise when we're next going to be reading some more horror literature. I think we haven't yet decided who the next stream will be on. It might not be horror, it might be a different author, a different genre.
think
but
we had some in mind.
we were talking about
Should I
Irene Nemirovsky, I think.
Yeah, I think we were thinking of Nemirovsky, but also if we're going to stick to short stories as well, we were also horror stories as well. We were also considering Du Maurier, the writer of The Birds and Don't Look Now, and also Shirley Jackson, who wrote
Yes.
the Lottery, which was an extremely influential story at the time.
I think we might start with one of those two. Or move on with one of those two.
It's definitely nice to have some horror when there's some dark evenings still. Although I am looking forward to summer.
Indeed, same. But yeah, so thank you everyone for joining, and we will let you all know via various channels when the next stream will be. Hopefully in a few weeks' time. So without further ado, good night.